The fragmented kingdom. The late 13th century in Scotland was not a time of knights in shining armor, but of mud, blood, and the crushing weight of occupation. After the death of King Alexander III, the Maid of Norway passed away, leaving the Scottish throne vacant. This power vacuum was the catalyst for centuries of strife. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, saw an opportunity not to mediate, but to conquer. Into this world of shifting loyalties was born Robert the Bruce. He was a man of Norman-Irish descent, a product of high nobility who held lands in both England and Scotland. In his early years, the Bruce was a man of ambiguity, torn between his duty to his family's claim to the throne and the pragmatic necessity of surviving the wrath of the English king. The turning point for the young Robert came with the rise of William Wallace. While Wallace was a man of the common folk, the Bruce was a man of the halls of power. History often paints them as seamless allies, but the reality was far more complex. The Bruce initially sided with the English, a move often criticized by modern romanticists, but it was a calculated gamble in a feudal system where one wrong move meant the execution of your entire lineage. However, as the English oppression deepened, evidenced by the brutal execution of Scottish nobles and the heavy taxation of the Kirk, the flicker of nationalism began to burn in Robert's heart. He realized that Scotland could never be a sovereign nation under the shadow of the Plantagenets. By 1304, the political landscape reached a boiling point. Robert the Bruce entered into a secret pact with Bishop Lamberton, a high-ranking churchman who envisioned a free Scotland. This was a dangerous treason. Robert's chief rival for the crown was John the Red Comyn. Their feud wasn't just political, it was ancestral. The tension peaked on February 10, 1306, inside the Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. In a moment of high drama and lethal consequence, an argument broke out before the high altar. Swords were drawn. By the time the dust settled, the Red Comyn lay dying on the cold stone floor, murdered by Robert's own hand. Robert the Bruce had committed the ultimate sin, murder in a holy place. He was now an outlaw, an excommunicate, and a man with no choice but to claim the crown or face the gallows. The fugitive king. Following the bloodletting at Dumfries, Robert had no path but forward. He rushed to Scone, the ancient site where Scottish kings had been inaugurated for centuries. In March 1306, with a small circle of loyalists and the defiant Countess of Buchan placing the circlet upon his head, he was crowned Robert I. But the crown was made of thorns, not gold. Edward I was incensed by the murder of Comyn and the treason of the coronation. He dispatched a massive force under Aymer de Valence to crush this King of Summer. At the Battle of Methven, Bruce's small, inexperienced army was routed in a night attack. The king was forced to flee into the wild highlands, his dreams of sovereignty seemingly shattered before they had even begun. The winter of 1306 to 1307 was the lowest point in Scottish history. Bruce became a ghost in his own land. His brothers were captured and brutally executed by the English. His wife and daughter were imprisoned. Legend says that while hiding in a cave on the island of Rathlin, Robert watched a spider attempt to spin a web. Time and again the spider fell, but on the seventh attempt it succeeded. This story, whether myth or truth, captures the American-style spirit of the underdog that defines the Bruce's legacy. He realized he could not fight a conventional war against the English juggernaut. He had to become a master of the landscape, utilizing the bogs, the glens, and the mountains to negate the heavy cavalry of the English knights. In early 1307, the spider returned to the mainland. His return was marked by a small but symbolic victory at Glen Troll, where his men used the terrain to ambush an English force. However, the true turning point was the Battle of Loudon Hill. Bruce utilized deep trenches to funnel the superior English cavalry into a narrow front, effectively neutralizing their charge. It was a masterclass in guerrilla tactics. As the English fled, the tide began to turn. Fate also intervened. The formidable Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died on his way north to finish Robert. He left the throne to his son, Edward II, a man far less capable, far less feared, and a man who would provide the Bruce the opening he needed to reclaim a kingdom.
The War of the Castles. With the death of the Hammer, the iron grip of England began to rust. Robert the Bruce recognized that his enemy was no longer a single man, but a network of stone. The English held castles. These fortresses were the nerve centers of the occupation. To win Scotland, Robert had to methodically dismantle this skeleton. He adopted a scorched earth and slight policy, capturing a castle only to raze it to the ground, ensuring it could never be reoccupied by English reinforcements. From 1308 to 1312, Bruce moved like a shadow across the north, destroying the strongholds of his Scottish enemies, the Commons, and the English garrisons alike. It was a brutal, total war that redefined the landscape of power. The siege warfare of this era was not defined by massive trebuchets, but by audacity. In 1314, Bruce's nephew, Thomas Randolph, scaled the precipitous cliffs of Edinburgh Castle under the cover of a pitch-black night with only 30 men. Simultaneously, Sir James Douglas, the legendary Black Douglas, captured Roxburgh Castle by disguising his men as cattle, crawling through the grass to bypass sentries. These daring, spec-op-style missions eroded English morale. By early 1314, only a few major strongholds remained, the most significant being Stirling Castle. The governor of Stirling made a fateful pact with the Scots. If an English relief force did not arrive by Midsummer's Day, the castle would surrender. This agreement set the stage for a confrontation that neither king could avoid. King Edward II, mocked by his barons for his perceived weakness, knew that losing Stirling meant losing Scotland forever. He summoned the largest army ever to invade the north, a massive host of heavy cavalry, Welsh longbowmen, and professional infantry. Robert the Bruce, meanwhile, chose his ground carefully at a small stream called the Bannockburn. He wasn't just preparing for a battle, he was preparing for a reckoning. He spent weeks training his schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, to do the impossible, withstand the charge of the finest knights in Christendom. The road to Bannockburn was paved with the sweat of commoners ready to defy a king. The Field of Bannockburn. The summer of 1314 brought the heat of destiny to the woods of the new park. On June 23rd, the English vanguard arrived, sightlines locking on to the Scottish position. The opening act of the battle became a legend of American-style rugged individualism. Sir Henry de Bohun, an English knight, spotted Robert the Bruce on a small palfrey, carrying only a battle axe. Bohun charged, seeking a quick end to the rebellion. Bruce didn't flinch. He sidestepped the heavy destrier and, rising in his stirrups, split Bohun's head and helmet with a single thunderous blow. When his commander scolded him for the risk, Bruce simply replied that he was sorry for the loss of his axe handle. As the sun rose on June 24th, the main engagement began. The English were cramped into a narrow strip of land between the trees and the river, their numbers working against them. Edward II ordered his knights to charge, but they met a wall of Scottish pikes. The schiltrons stood firm, a human forest of iron points that the English horses refused to impale themselves upon. The terrain became a trap. As the front lines of the English were pushed back, they collided with their own advancing infantry. Chaos reigned.
The legendary Welsh longbowmen, usually the terror of the Scots, were caught in the crossfire or run down by the small but agile Scottish cavalry. The final blow came not from the nobility, but from the small folk. A reserve of camp followers, seeing the English waver, rushed down the hill with improvised banners and weapons. The exhausted English, thinking a fresh Scottish army had arrived, broke into a full-out rout. King Edward II fled the field, escaping by sea. Thousands of English soldiers were driven into the Bannockburn, where the stream ran red with blood. Robert the Bruce had done the impossible. He had shattered the myth of English invincibility on a fair field. Scotland was now a land of victors, and the road to formal independence, though still long and bloody, was finally clear.
The Declaration of Sovereignty. Victory at Bannockburn did not mean instant peace. King Edward II refused to recognize Robert as anything more than a rebellious traitor. To the world, the Bruce was still a usurper, excommunicated by the Pope. To legitimize his rule, Robert moved from the sword to the pen. In 1320, a group of Scottish nobles gathered at Arbroath Abbey to sign one of the most significant documents in political history, the Declaration of Arbroath. It was a letter to Pope John XXII, drafted with a revolutionary idea. It argued that the king did not rule by divine right alone, but by the consent of the people. It was a precursor to the modern ideals of American democracy, a statement that liberty was worth more than gold or life itself. The language of the Declaration was visceral. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. This wasn't just diplomatic fluff, it was a warning. Robert was signaling that even if he himself were to falter, the Scottish people would find another to lead their resistance. The document worked. The Pope, seeing the resolve of the Scots and the instability of the English crown, began to shift his stance. He urged Edward II to make peace. Meanwhile, Robert didn't wait for permission. He launched raids into northern England, taking the war to the doorsteps of those who had once burned his lands. By the mid-1320s, the Bruce had transitioned from a fugitive to a statesman. He reorganized the Scottish government, established a new parliament, and ensured that the line of succession was secure. But the toll of decades of warfare was beginning to show on his body. Many chroniclers suggest he suffered from a skin ailment, often theorized to be leprosy, though modern historians suspect it was more likely the physical breakdown from years of living in damp caves and on the front lines. Despite his failing health, he achieved his ultimate goal in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. England finally recognized him as the independent king of a sovereign Scotland. He had survived the hammer, the spider, and the Pope, emerging as the undisputed architect of a nation. The king's heart. By 1329, the architect of Scottish independence was fading. Robert the Bruce lay on his deathbed at Cardross, his body broken by decades of guerrilla campaigning and the harsh Highland winters. He had achieved the impossible, a treaty with England and a recognized crown. But one vow remained unfulfilled. He had never made his promised pilgrimage to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. On his deathbed, he summoned his most loyal companion, the Black Douglas, and made a final cinematic request. He asked that upon his death, his heart be removed, placed in a silver casket, and taken to the Holy Land so that it might find the peace he never knew in life. Robert the Bruce passed away on June 7, 1329. His body was buried in Dunfermline Abbey, but his heart began a legendary odyssey.
Sir James Douglas hung the silver casket around his neck and set sail for the east. However, fate took a detour. In Spain, Douglas joined the forces of King Alfonso XI of Castile against the Moors at the Battle of Teba. Surrounded and knowing he would not survive, legend says Douglas took the casket and flung it into the thick of the enemy, shouting, "Forward, brave heart, as thou wert wont, and Douglas will follow thee or die." Douglas fell in battle, but the heart was recovered by the survivors and brought back to Scotland. The heart of the king found its final resting place in Melrose Abbey, buried beneath the high altar. Today, Robert the Bruce is remembered not just as a king, but as a symbol of the American spirit centuries before it had a name. The belief that a small group of determined people, led by a man with nothing to lose, can take on the greatest empire in the world and win. He transformed from an ambiguous noble into a national icon, a man whose legacy is etched into the very stones of the Scottish landscape. He was the king who taught a nation that freedom is not a gift, but a prize won through iron, blood, and an unbreakable will.
The shadow of the crown, the Bruce's legacy. With the passing of the Bruce, Scotland was left in a fragile state. Robert's son, David II, was only 5 years old. The stability Robert had fought so hard to build was suddenly threatened by the disinherited Scottish nobles who had sided with the English and lost their lands. Edward III of England, seeing a weak child on the throne, violated the peace treaty. The 1330s saw a resurgence of conflict that felt like a dark echo of the past. Yet the blueprint Robert had left behind, the tactical use of the landscape and the fierce sense of national identity, became the armor of the Scottish people. The kingdom did not fold because the people now believed in the idea of Scotland as a sovereign entity, a seed planted firmly by the Bruce. The shift in power eventually led to the rise of the House of Stuart. Robert's daughter, Marjorie Bruce, had married Walter Stuart, the 6th High Steward of Scotland. Their union was the bridge between the Bruce line and the long-reigning Stuart dynasty. While Robert was the warrior king who secured independence, the Stuarts became the administrators who would navigate the Renaissance and eventually unite the crowns of Scotland and England centuries later. However, this transition was fraught with betrayal and internal strife. The Bruce's death had left a power vacuum that local lords, the Black Douglases and the Red Commons alike, tried to fill with blood and steel. As the mid-14th century progressed, the legend of Robert the Bruce took on a life of its own. He was no longer just a historical figure. He was the primary character in the epic poem The Bruce by John Barber. In the eyes of the common folk, he was a hero who had overcome excommunication and exile to restore the dignity of the North. This narrative became the backbone of Scottish resistance for generations. To this day, American history buffs find a kinship in this era, the story of a frontier kingdom resisting an encroaching empire. Robert's life demonstrated that a nation's borders are drawn not just on maps, but in the collective memory of its people, reinforced by the blood of those willing to hold the line.
The Scourge of God. The mid-14th century brought a horror that cared nothing for borders or crowns. As Scotland struggled to maintain the independence Robert wanted won, a silent killer arrived on the merchant ships from the continent, the Black Death. By 1349, the plague had crossed the border from England. Chroniclers of the time estimated that nearly a third of the Scottish population vanished in a matter of months. For a nation already thinned by decades of war, this was an existential blow. The economy collapsed, Fields lay fallow, and the feudal system that supported the nobility began to crumble. Yet, ironically, the plague hit the crowded English cities harder than the scattered Scottish glens, briefly stalling any major southern invasion. Amidst this biological catastrophe, the young King David II returned from exile in France. Unlike his father, David lacked the tactical genius and the rugged patience required to manage the Scottish lords. In an attempt to capitalize on English weakness during the 100 Years' War, David invaded England in 1346, only to be defeated and captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross. For 11 long years, the Bruce's heir remained a prisoner in the Tower of London. Scotland was once again a kingdom without a king, ruled by guardians who were more interested in their own power than the preservation of the Bruce's legacy. The high taxes levied to pay David's eventual ransom bled the country dry, nearly undoing the economic recovery Robert I had initiated. The internal politics of Scotland became a deadly chess match. Without the iron hand of Robert the Bruce to guide them, the powerful families, the Stuarts, the Douglases, and the Earls of March, began to carve out their own mini-kingdoms. The borderlands between England and Scotland, known as the Marches, became a lawless Wild West. This was the era of the border reivers, where loyalty was to the family name rather than the crown. History remembers this as a period of fragmentation, yet beneath the chaos, the cultural identity of the Scot was hardening. The commoners, left to fend for themselves against both the plague and the English, developed a fierce, localized self-reliance that would define the Scottish character for centuries to come.
The passing of the torch. By 1371, the biological line of Robert the Bruce reached a silent end. King David II died childless, leaving the throne to his nephew, Robert Stuart, the son of the Bruce's daughter, Marjorie. This transition marked the beginning of the House of Stuart, a dynasty that would rule for over 3 centuries. Robert II was no longer the young warrior who had fought alongside the Bruce. He was a man in his 50s, cautious and burdened by the complexity of managing the Wolf of Badenoch and other unruly nobles. The era of the single titanic hero king was over, replaced by a political machine that had to balance diplomacy with the ever-present threat of civil war. The shift from Bruce to Stuart changed the nature of the Scottish identity. While Robert the Bruce was the King of Scots, a leader of a people, the Stuarts began the slow process of becoming the Kings of Scotland, leaders of a territory. This subtle distinction brought about a golden age of castle building and the expansion of the Kirk. However, the border wars with England remained a constant rhythmic drumbeat of violence. The Black Douglas family, once the most loyal supporters of the Bruce, grew so powerful that they became a rival to the throne itself. The peace Robert I had fought for was now a domestic struggle to keep the very men who won independence from tearing the kingdom apart. In the American historical lens, this period mirrors the era of good feelings turned sour, a time when the external enemy had retreated and internal factions began to vie for the soul of the nation. The legacy of the Bruce remained the moral compass. Whenever the English threatened to reclaim the hammer's former glory, the Stuarts would invoke the memory of Bannockburn to rally the clans. Even as the crown passed from hand to hand, the myth of the Bruce lived in the songs of the bards and the laws of the Parliament, ensuring that while the man was dead, the sovereign spirit he breathed into the mud of Scotland could never be extinguished.
The Old Alliance and the French connection. As the 14th century matured, Scotland found itself a vital piece on the European chessboard. Robert the Bruce's legacy had left a kingdom that was independent but perpetually under-resourced. To keep England at bay, the Scottish crown solidified the Old Alliance with France. This was a classic "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" strategy. Whenever the English kings set their sights on French soil during the 100 Years' War, the Scots would mount an invasion from the north to divert English forces. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a cultural exchange. Scottish knights began to mirror the flamboyant chivalry of the French, and fine Bordeaux wines began to flow into the cold halls of Edinburgh, contrasting the rugged simplicity of the Bruce's era. This alliance, however, was a double-edged sword. While it provided Scotland with prestige and tactical support, it often dragged the nation into conflicts that served French interests more than Scottish ones. The border remained a no-man's land of constant skirmishing. Unlike the unified war effort led by the Bruce, these were wars of attrition and vanity. The Scottish nobility, growing wealthy from French coin, began to prioritize their individual power bases. The centralized control Robert I had established started to fray as the Earls of the North and the Lords of the Isles began acting like independent sovereigns, reminiscent of the chaotic power vacuum that existed before the hammer fell. Yet, the Bruce's influence remained the underlying heartbeat of the army. Even as Scottish tactics modernized, the core strength was still the schiltron, the tight-knit spear formation that had crushed the knights at Bannockburn. The identity of the Scottish soldier was becoming legendary across Europe as fearsome, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to their kin. This reputation allowed many Scots to serve as elite bodyguards for the French kings, the famous Garde Écossaise. In the American historical perspective, this represents the evolution of a provincial militia into a globally respected professional force exported to protect the very liberty they had won at home.
The shadow of the Douglas. By the turn of the 15th century, the name Douglas had become as formidable as Bruce. The descendants of the Black Douglas had evolved into a state within a state. Holding vast territories across the south, they were the wardens of the marches, the primary defense against the English. But power this concentrated inevitably bred friction with the Stuart kings. The Douglases maintained their own private armies, their own courts, and increasingly their own foreign policy. For the average Scot, the Bruce's dream of a unified nation was being tested by the very families who helped forge it. The Stuart kings found themselves in a precarious position, reigning over a kingdom where the subjects were often better armed than the monarch. The struggle for control reached a bloody crescendo in the mid-1400s. King James II, growing weary of the Douglas arrogance, invited William, the 8th Earl of Douglas, to Stirling Castle under a safe conduct agreement. The meeting, intended for reconciliation, turned into a slaughter. In a fit of rage reminiscent of Robert the Bruce's murder of the Red Comyn, the king himself stabbed the earl, and his guards finished the job, throwing the body out of a castle window. This black dinner style of politics shocked the nation. It was a regression to the lawlessness Robert the Bruce had tried to civilize. Robert had killed a rival to claim a crown. James II killed a subject to save one. The fall of the Black Douglases was swift. The king declared them traitors and seized their lands, but the victory was Pyrrhic. It left the Scottish border vulnerable and the nobility deeply suspicious of the crown. Despite the internal gore, the spirit of independence Robert I had instilled never wavered. Even as the leaders killed one another, the common soldier held the line against England. In the American historical tradition, this period is viewed as the crisis of the Union, the painful process of defining whether a nation is held together by voluntary loyalty to a hero's legacy or by the cold iron force of the centralized state.
The Renaissance on the frontier. By the late 1400s, Scotland entered a golden age under King James IV. While the spirit of the Bruce was one of survival and iron, James IV introduced the spirit of the intellect. He was a true Renaissance prince, fluent in many languages, a patron of the first printing press in Scotland, and a builder of a world-class navy, headlined by the massive warship Great Michael. The kingdom Robert I had founded out of mud and desperation was now a center of European learning and naval power. The American dream of starting from nothing to achieve global prestige was finally being realized on the jagged coasts of the North Sea. James IV sought to heal the wounds Robert the Bruce had opened with England. In 1303, a marriage was arranged between James and Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII of England. This marriage of the thistle and the rose was intended to create a perpetual peace. It was the ultimate diplomatic fruit of the seeds Robert I had planted at Bannockburn. England now treated Scotland as a dynastic equal rather than a vassal state. The architecture changed accordingly. Defensive keeps were softened into palatial residences. However, the shadow of the Bruce still loomed. The Scots never fully trusted the old enemy, and beneath the velvet of the Renaissance, the iron of the Highlands remained sharp. The peace was, unfortunately, not perpetual. When King Henry VIII invaded France, the old alliance called Scotland to action. James IV, despite his love for peace, felt a feudal obligation to honor the alliance that had sustained Scotland since the Bruce's time. In 1513, he led the largest, most technologically advanced Scottish army ever assembled across the border. They carried the heavy cannons of the Renaissance, but they fought with the same stubborn courage Robert I had inspired. At the Battle of Flodden, the destiny of the Bruce's lineage took a tragic turn. James IV became the last monarch in Great Britain to die in battle, a testament to the fact that the Scottish kings, like Robert before them, were still leaders who led from the front.
The daughter of debates. The death of James IV at Flodden left Scotland in a familiar, agonizing position. A minor on the throne and a kingdom ripe for external manipulation. The perpetual peace lay shattered. However, the lineage of the Bruce endured through the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. Ascending to the throne at only 6 days old, her existence became the central focus of the rough wooing. Henry VIII's brutal military campaign to force a marriage between Mary and his son, Edward VI. Henry wanted to accomplish through marriage what Edward Longshanks had failed to do through the sword, the total absorption of Scotland. But the spirit of Robert I was etched into the Scottish regions. They spirited Mary away to France, preferring exile over annexation. Mary's return to Scotland in 1561 as a young widow brought the Renaissance to its final dramatic peak. But the Scotland she returned to was no longer just the Scotland of the Bruce. It was now the Scotland of John Knox and the Protestant Reformation. The religious fervor added a new layer of complexity to the national identity. While Robert I had fought for political sovereignty, the new generation was fighting for spiritual independence. Mary, a devout Catholic, ruling a burgeoning Protestant nation, found herself caught in a vice. The feudal lords, descendants of the men who stood with the Bruce, were now divided not just by lands, but by Bibles. Her reign was a whirlwind of intrigue, murders in holy places, mirroring the Red Comyn's end, secret marriages, and eventually civil war. Like Robert the Bruce, Mary found herself a fugitive in her own land, forced to seek refuge across the border. However, unlike the Bruce, she found no spider in a cave to inspire her return. She found only the iron will of her cousin, Elizabeth I. Mary's captivity and eventual execution are often seen as the tragic end of an era. Yet from an American historical perspective, she represents the struggle of the individual leader caught in the gears of shifting institutional powers, a precursor to the themes of revolution and the rights of the governed that would define the centuries to follow.
The convergence of destinies. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent shockwaves through Europe.
But the iron logic of dynastic succession, a system Robert the Bruce had shed blood to stabilize, prevailed. In 1603, the ultimate historical irony unfolded. Queen Elizabeth I of England died without an heir, and the crown of England passed to the Scottish king, James VI, the great-great-great-grandson of the marriage between the thistle and the rose. The union of the crowns was achieved not by a sword, but by a family tree. Robert the Bruce's descendant now sat on the throne of his greatest enemy. For the first time, the hammer and the anvil were held by the same man. James VI, now also James I of England, moved his court to London, but he brought the stubborn Scottish identity with him. He styled himself as the King of Great Britain, a visionary attempt to blend the two warring cultures into a single entity. From an American perspective, this was a massive geopolitical merger, the birth of a superpower. Yet the transition was painful. The Scottish commoners felt abandoned as their king moved south, and the English lords resented being ruled by a Scotsman. The ghost of the Bruce remained a silent witness. The political independence won at Bannockburn was now being traded for a partnership in an emerging empire. The Stuart kings in London found themselves ruling a divided people. The religious wars that began under Mary now morphed into the Covenanter movement in Scotland, a fierce resistance against English-styled church government. These Covenanters were the spiritual heirs to the Bruce's guerrillas. They met in secret in the hills, signed manifestos in their own blood, and resisted royal decrees with a zeal that would later influence the American settlers. The legacy of the Bruce had shifted from the crown to the people. The belief that one's conscience was sovereign, even against a king, became the new Declaration of Arbroath for a modern age.
The King against the Covenant. The 17th century brought a violent collision between the crown and the conscience. Robert the Bruce had fought for the right of a nation to exist. Now, his descendants, the Stuart kings, were fighting to define how that nation should be governed. King Charles I, believing in the divine right of kings, attempted to impose a uniform liturgy on the Scots. He underestimated the fire that Robert I had lit in the Scottish soul. In 1638, thousands gathered in Edinburgh to sign the National Covenant, some reportedly in their own blood, vowing to resist any royal encroachment on their faith. This was the spiritual successor to the Declaration of Arbroath, a document of defiance that prioritized religious liberty over royal decree. The tension erupted into the Bishops' Wars, which acted as the spark for the wider English Civil War. The Scots were caught in a brutal paradox. They opposed Charles I's religious policies, yet their ancient loyalty to the Bruce's bloodline pulled them toward the throne. When the war between the king and the English Parliament ended in the king's execution in 1499, Scotland stood as the last bastion for the Stuart cause. They crowned his son, Charles II, at Scone, the same sacred ground where the Bruce was inaugurated. This final, desperate act of loyalty brought down the wrath of Oliver Cromwell. The legendary Hammer of the Scots was reborn in the form of a Republican general, whose modern, disciplined, new model army crushed the traditional Scottish forces at the Battle of Dunbar. The subsequent Cromwellian occupation was the first time Scotland was truly absorbed into a republic. The ancient symbols of sovereignty were systematically targeted. The Stone of Destiny, already in London, was mirrored by the destruction of royal symbols in Scottish keeps. Yet even under the boot of Cromwell, the decentralized, stubborn nature of the clans made a total union impossible. The memory of Robert the Bruce's cave and his spider began to circulate once more in secret meetings and border ballads. From an American historical viewpoint, this was the ultimate test of resilience, maintaining a national identity through the dark night of occupation, waiting for the restoration of the rightful ancestral order.
The Union of Parliaments and the Eternal Spirit. The start of the 18th century marked the final geopolitical transformation of Robert the Bruce's kingdom. In 1707, the Act of Union was passed, merging the Scottish and English parliaments into a single Great Britain. To some, it was a parcel of rogues selling out a nation for English gold. To others, it was the only way to survive in a world dominated by colonial empires. But even as the legal documents were signed, the cultural independence forged at Bannockburn refused to die. The Jacobite risings that followed were the final, thunderous echoes of the Bruce's War. Men of the clans rising one last time to place a Stuart king back on the throne. Though the risings ended in the tragedy of Culloden, the spirit of the Bruce underwent a remarkable American-style evolution. It transitioned from a political movement into a global cultural phenomenon. Sir Walter Scott and Robert Burns resurrected the Bruce as a romantic icon for the common man. The values Robert I lived by, self-reliance, the rejection of tyranny, and the belief that a rugged few could defeat a monolithic power, became the bedrock of the Scottish Enlightenment. These ideals were carried across the Atlantic by thousands of Scots-Irish immigrants, directly informing the language of the American Declaration of Independence and the frontier spirit of the United States. Today, Robert the Bruce is more than a name in a history book. He is a permanent fixture of the human longing for sovereignty. Standing before his statue at Stirling, overlooking the fields of Bannockburn, one realizes that his true victory was not the defeat of an army, but the creation of a national heartbeat. He proved that history is not a static line of inevitable conquerors, but a story written by those with the courage to swing the axe and the patience to watch the spider. From a medieval fugitive to the father of a nation, Robert the Bruce remains the eternal reminder that freedom, once won in the heart, can never be taken by the sword.